excited that this great event is being covered by the media to the extent that it is. I don't mind admitting this to the press. I'm a little weary at this point. But it's something about the spirit of justice that raises up like a war horse. That horse that stands with its back sunk in. And he hears that bell. And I like to say the bell of freedom. And all of a sudden, it becomes straight and the back becomes stiff. And you become determined all over again.
But there's something about the spirit of justice. Ever since I recorded this clip of Myrlie Evers Williams at a press conference in 2017, that phrase has stuck with me. It was so remarkable to me that this woman, in her 80s at the time, could be so determined to continue the struggle for racial justice. I mean, she's speaking at the grand opening of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, a museum where they have on display the rifle used to assassinate her husband, Medgar Evers, on their front doorstep. As I do this work of racial justice and studying our nation's history, I found that injustice is common. Evil is unremarkable because it's always so present. Devastating, enraging, yes, but not surprising. You know what is surprising? What is remarkable? It's not that injustice shows up so often, it's that the spirit of justice always shows up too. The spirit of justice is the inner force that moves us to demand dignity and respect for ourselves and others. It's the cry of our souls for the world to be a fair and kind place. People choose to do the wrong thing all the time. But there are people who tap into the spirit of justice, just like Myrlie Evers Williams did, and find the strength to rise up, resist, and get determined all over again. Howard Thurman, the great mystic and theologian who wrote the classic book, Jesus and the Disinherited, also wrote in the preface to that book, "Why is it that Christianity seems impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with issues of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin? Is this impotency due to a betrayal of the genius of the religion? Or is it due to a basic weakness of the religion itself?" It's a haunting question, and a valid one. Much of the history of race and religion in the US is one of compromise and complicity. The failure of many people, Christians, to fight racism has led people to ask the question whether Christianity is the white man's religion, or as Thurman wrote it, impotent to offer anything helpful in the struggle for racial justice. I understand the question, but there's more to the story. What about the Black Christian tradition? What about the people who engaged the spirit of justice and instead of compromising with racism, courageously confronted it? We have this great cloud of historical witnesses who all testify that the gospel is one of liberation. It's about good news to the poor and setting the oppressed free, just like Jesus said. And we need these stories now. We're facing a social and political landscape that is deeply divided. The freedom to vote is at risk. The peaceful transfer of power is threatened. After historic racial justice uprisings in 2020, we saw a massive backlash in the form of anti-critical race theory rhetoric, defunding diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, the repeal of affirmative action provisions, and even opposition to African American studies curricula. We need some history. We need some hope. We need the spirit of justice. When we look across hundreds of years, through every era of U.S. history, we learn about dozens of people and their real-life, true stories of living for justice. Across all these different years and different people, we find some virtues they all had in common: faith, courage, imagination, and resilience. Can I get spiritual for a minute here? The Bible says in Ephesians, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." The people who resisted racism understood their battle wasn't just against flesh and blood. It was spiritual, and they needed faith for the fight. And one of the best examples of faith I found was Sister Thea Bowman. Born as Bertha Bowman in Mississippi in 1937, she's been called the most well-known African-American religious sister in U.S. Catholic history. She went to a Catholic school and at the age of 9 was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. In high school, she sensed a call to the Catholic sisterhood. And in 1956, this young Black woman from Mississippi became a sister in the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. She eventually earned a PhD and became an outspoken advocate for racial reconciliation. Toward the end of her life, cut tragically short by cancer, she spoke to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, a group of powerful and almost exclusively white men. She talked about the reality Black people faced in the church. She said it was like being a second or third class citizen of the Holy City. But she had faith that together, white and Black Christians could build something better.
If we walk and talk and work and play and stand together in Jesus' name, we'll be who we say we are, truly Catholic. And we shall overcome. Overcome the poverty, overcome the loneliness, overcome the alienation, and build together a holy city, a New Jerusalem, a city set apart where they'll know we are His because we love one another.
After she died in 1990, those who knew her best remarked about how Bowman did more than simply live. Her friend Margaret Walker Alexander, a renowned writer, educator, and poet, expressed a sentiment many others held as well. I think Sister Thea is a modern-day saint. A saint who showed us what faith looks like. I think the virtue that makes any justice possible is courage. And I can think of no bolder historical example of courage than Fannie Lou Hamer. Born in Mississippi in 1917, she was the 20th of 20 children. She had 3 strikes against her in this world. She was poor, she was Black, and she was a woman. And she would have lived and died in obscurity if it hadn't been for one fateful evening at her church when she heard a presentation about voting rights. When the civil rights organizers asked for volunteers to go register to vote, Hamer said she raised her hand as high as it could go. And that began a long career in civil rights activism. Reflecting later on that moment, when she raised her hand to risk everything and try to register to vote, she said, "I guess if I'd had any sense, I'd have been a little scared. But what was the point of being scared? The only thing they could do was kill me, and it seemed like they'd been trying to do that a little bit at a time ever since I could remember." That's courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to move forward in the face of it. Courage can be cultivated. The more you exercise it, the more of it you have. By the 1950s, legal racial segregation had been the law of the land for half a century. Especially in the South, it seemed like the system was inevitable and indestructible. But someone had the determination, the creativity, the imagination to devise a plan that would ultimately topple Jim Crow in the courts. His name was Charles Hamilton Houston. Houston may not be well known today, but he was the architect of the legal strategy to challenge racial segregation in public accommodations in the courts. He was born in 1895 in Washington, D.C. to a lawyer for a father and an attentive stay-at-home mother. He graduated from Amherst College as one of the top students in his class. When he served as an officer in World War I, he experienced crushing racism and said, "I made up my mind that I would never get caught again without knowing something about my rights, and I would study law and use my time fighting for men who couldn't strike back." So he went to Harvard Law School and then taught at the historically black Howard University and made its law school the most prestigious one at any HBCU. Houston taught his law students based on the philosophy that lawyers should be social engineers. They should use their skills in the law to help craft a better society and not just for personal gain. The NAACP eventually tapped him to head up their legal efforts to fight racism. From there, Houston started challenging the separate but equal portion in the Supreme Court decision of Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Long story short, the strategy worked. Lawyers such as Thurgood Marshall, Houston's most well-known protege, used the strategy to win the Brown v. Board case and help topple the Jim Crow system of racial segregation in schools and other facilities. We don't often think of the word imagination in the context of justice. But whether it's in the courtroom or on the streets, imagination is precisely what we need to envision a better reality. I first wrote about Charles Morgan Jr. in my book, The Color of Compromise. He was the lawyer who, in the wake of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham in 1963, gave a speech that would change his life. Shortly after the bombing, he stood in front of an all-white businessmen's club and challenged them with the words, "Who did it? Who threw that bomb?" The answer should be, we all did it. And he wasn't talking to the KKK, the racial terrorists. He was talking to good people, the respectable people, the people who let racism go unchallenged, and now we're seeing the tragic and bloody results. Morgan's speech illustrated the principle of compromise and complicity with racism. But I didn't tell you what happened next. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., Morgan received a call at his house. "Is the mortician there yet?" "I don't know any morticians," Morgan responded. "Well, you will when the bodies are all over your front yard." That was the first of many threats that kept coming. The backlash had become so unrelenting that the Morgan family decided to leave the city. Morgan said, "There was no way for us to remain in the city of which I had been a part, yet from which I had grown apart." But Morgan is an example of resilience because he didn't quit. He went on to have a notable career in civil rights law. He helped represent Muhammad Ali when the champion boxer refused to enter the draft during the Vietnam War. He sued to desegregate his alma mater, the University of Alabama. He defended civil rights leader Julian Bond when he was denied his rightful seat in the Georgia legislature. Morgan never again lived in the city of Birmingham, where he had so boldly confronted racism. But he is an example of resilience because the spirit of justice in him wouldn't let him quit. How do you keep going when it looks like you're not winning? How do you maintain your pace on this marathon journey of racial justice? Well, part of the answer is we don't have to do it alone. We can learn from this great cloud of historical witnesses whose true story and real lives can inspire us to keep going. Look for the history you never learned in school. Look for the people who have too often been minimized, forgotten, or outright erased from history. Look for the dangerous past, the subversive story. These are the real, true narratives of people in every age in the midst of the most impossible circumstances who drew on the spirit of justice to keep going. Look for the spirit of justice, making you determined all over again. Thanks for watching. I write about all these stories and more in my latest book, The Spirit of Justice: True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. It's available now wherever you get your books. And you can follow me on social media at Jemar Tisby, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and be sure to keep up with my latest work at jemartisby.substack.com.